Welcome back. Okay, let's jump straight into this explainer. Today, we're doing a deep dive to objectively unpack the massive political and economic systems that basically govern our modern world. We're going on a pretty fascinating journey through the history of human economic organization. We'll be looking at how the way we manage resources, labor, and power has completely reshaped a globe over the last few centuries.
To kick things off, consider this intensely provocative quote from Karl Marx. "Capital is dead labor, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks." Wow, right? It perfectly captures the intense, historically polarizing passions that economic theories can ignite. We aren't just talking about dry statistics or dusty textbooks here. No, we're talking about ideologies that have literally sparked revolutions, built empires, and defined the very fabric of our societies.
So to make sense of all this, our roadmap today traces a grand historical arc of action and reaction. We're going to map out exactly how one ideology inevitably birthed the next. First, decoding capitalism. Second, the socialist response. Third, the mechanics of colonialism. Fourth, the era of decolonization. And finally, globalization and neocolonialism. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Decoding capitalism.
If we want to understand the foundational engine of our modern era, we really have to start with its core definition. Capitalism is an economic system wherein the means of production are privately owned, economic life is organized through market principles, and production is geared solely towards profit. The crucial takeaway here? Capitalism emerged from the modern period as a massive economic engine driven by material self-interest, private property, and the spirit of enterprise. It essentially replaces bonded labor with wage labor, relying heavily on a hands-off government approach. It just lets the invisible hand of the market dictate demand, supply, and price.
Now, capitalism didn't just pop up overnight. It actively sprouted from the dismantled agrarian structures of feudalism over several centuries. Look back at the 11th century. You had innovations like the three-field crop rotation system that spiked productivity, displaced peasants, and sparked urban migration. Fast forward to the Black Death in the mid-14th century. That caused massive labor shortages, which, believe it or not, actually made labor a super valuable commodity and weakened the grip of feudal lords. Add in the centralization of monarchies with their own standing armies, and you've got the perfect storm for a new capital-centric economic order to take root in Europe's growing cities.
This brings us to a really fascinating ideological clash. How do we actually interpret this new system? On one hand, you have the classical liberal conception championed by Adam Smith. He saw free markets and the laissez-faire system as a super-efficient wealth creator, naturally moving toward universal prosperity via that famous invisible hand. On the flip side, you have the Marxist conception. Karl Marx viewed the exact same mechanics as a system of inherent exploitation. He argued that a propertyless labor class, the proletariat, is alienated and squeezed to generate surplus value, basically unpaid labor that turns into profit for the bourgeoisie. It's a striking duality. One side sees the ultimate engine of innovation, the other sees a machine built purely on systemic inequality.
Moving on to Section 2, the socialist response.
All that immense concentration of wealth and the harsh realities of the Industrial Revolution triggered our next major historical reaction. To really grasp socialism, we first have to recognize its incredible variety. As the philosopher C.E.M. Joad Whittley pointed out, socialism is a hat that anyone can wear. What he meant was that socialism isn't just one rigid, monolithic idea. It's highly adaptable. It takes on very different shapes depending on who is defining it and what specific societal problems they're trying to solve. But at its absolute core, it seeks to address the inequalities generated by unrestricted capitalism through some form of collective control over resources.
We see this divide super clearly when we compare the two main early schools of thought. First, there's utopian socialism, promoted by thinkers like Robert Owen and Charles Fourier. Owen actually went out and built ideal cooperative mill towns with shorter workdays and schools for kids. It was a very moral, peaceful vision of change. Then you have Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' scientific socialism. They completely rejected those utopian visions as unrealistic. Instead, they argued that history is driven by dialectical materialism, the idea that societal change comes from unavoidable conflict between material needs and different economic classes. For them, a proletarian revolution wasn't just a nice idea. It was a historical inevitability to overthrow the capitalist class.
From that core divide, socialism branched out into some vastly different strategic movements. Each one offered a distinct method for achieving a society based on equal distribution. You've got Fabianism, which pushed for a peaceful, legal transition championed by intellectuals. Collectivism aimed to nationalize industries through the ballot box.
But as you go down the list, the strategies get a lot more radical. Category socialism envisioned worker control without external pressures. Leninism adapted Marx's ideas for a less industrialized Russia, using a highly disciplined vanguard party to lead the charge. And Maoism took it even further in China, realizing that in a highly rural society, the revolution had to be driven by a mobilized peasant army instead of urban factory workers.
Ultimately, these competing ideological frameworks stepped right up to the political podium. Throughout the 20th century, these weren't just abstract academic debates. They were fierce, real-world battles over exactly how state power should be wielded, how national resources should be managed, and what the role of human labor should be within the whole state apparatus.
Which brings us to Section 3, the mechanics of colonialism.
Now, while those intense debates over capitalism and socialism were raging across Europe, a completely different dynamic was playing out globally. As capitalist nations rapidly industrialized, their relentless hunger for cheap raw materials and new, captive markets pushed them aggressively outward. Colonialism is defined as a large-scale system where a geopolitical entity establishes political and economic control beyond its borders. And let's be clear, this wasn't merely geographic expansion. It was a deeply unequal relationship built on foreign hegemony. It was frequently justified by a heavily flawed, racialized narrative known as the white man's burden. This false assumption that colonizers were somehow bringing superior civilization and governance to so-called subordinate subjects.
So what did this actually look like in practice? The core features of colonial exploitation involved forcefully integrating colonies into the world capitalist market, but on wildly unequal terms. Thinkers like Dadabai Nawaroji pointed out early on that the primary function of colonialism was a systematic drain of wealth from the periphery straight into the imperial metropolis. To pull this off, colonizers deliberately destroyed competing indigenous industries. And sure, they introduced modern infrastructure like massive railway networks in India or Africa, but the underlying objective was rarely local development. It was almost entirely designed to accelerate the extraction of resources from the interior straight to the coastal ports.
This timeline clearly maps out how that extraction evolved over 4 centuries. From 1500 to 1800, we see the mercantile phase, defined by monopoly, trade, and outright plunder. Then, moving into the 1800s, we hit the era of colonial expansion. This was marked by aggressive free trade policies and direct political and military control over vast swaths of Asia and Africa. Finally, by the mid-20th century, as direct rule became way too costly to maintain, the system morphed into neo-colonization, a new era relying heavily on financial capital and indirect influence.
All right, Section 4, the era of decolonization. Every historical action has a reaction, right? And the massive pressure of the colonial system naturally sparked an explosive pushback. Decolonization is the process through which these occupied territories finally achieved autonomy and self-rule. Following the utter devastation of the World Wars, the United Nations officially recognized the fundamental right to self-determination. This essentially forced empires to transform back into independent nation-states. But the path to independence varied wildly. In some places, it was achieved through mass, nonviolent resistance, most notably led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi in India. In other regions, thinkers like Frantz Fanon argued that colonialism was inherently violent and could only be overthrown through revolutionary armed struggle.
The collapse of those formal empires definitely didn't happen all at once. It rolled out in distinct ways. First, you had the Atlantic revolutions freeing the Americas between 1776 and 1826. Then, British dominion started demanding autonomy. But the truly massive wave hit between the 1940s and 1960s. This was heavily accelerated by the devastating economic toll the world wars took on European powers, making it financially impossible for them to hold on to their territories in Asia and Africa. Finally, the late 20th century saw the fall of the last European colonies, like Portugal's, and the eventual disintegration of the Soviet Empire.
And that leads us into Section 5, globalization and neo-colonialism. Here's the catch. The formal end of an empire doesn't always mean the end of unequal power dynamics. The term neo-colonialism was actually coined by Kwame Nkrumah, the very first president of an independent Ghana. It highlights a modern system where former colonial powers, alongside massive multinational corporations and global financial institutions, maintain a powerful grip on developing nations without ever needing to deploy an occupying army. How do they do it? Through conditional foreign aid, crushing debt patronage, and something called technological rent, charging steep prices for patented knowledge and modern machinery. It's a system where sovereignty is technically recognized on paper, but deep economic dependency remains a really harsh reality. This all ties perfectly into the complex web of globalization, and scholars heavily debate what this hyper-connected world actually means for the power of individual countries. Retreat scholars, they believe traditional state power is just eroding completely in the face of global markets. State-centric thinkers argue the exact opposite, claiming that states are still the main players and globalization is really just a massive technological upgrade. Meanwhile, transformationalists take the middle ground. They argue that state power isn't vanishing at all. It's just being fundamentally reorganized by international networks and global capital.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of today's explainer. As we look at the immense economic forces currently shaping our world, the rise of conditional aid, technological rent, and hyper-globalized neoliberal markets, I want to leave you to ponder this. Has the pendulum of history truly broken free of colonial exploitation, or has it merely changed its disguise? The dynamics of power are constantly shifting, but understanding the roots of capitalism, the socialist response, and the legacy of empires gives us the crucial tools we need to decode the world around us today. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.